Welcome to this presentation on intergenerational succession and internationalization strategy of family SMEs. And in this research, we report some evidence from China. This research was co-authored with my colleagues, Dr. Chris Graves and Dr. Frank, and this study has already been published in Long Range Planning, which is a strategic management journal. So first of all, some background information. Internationalization in literature and practice is recognized as an important process of firm increasing involvement in foreign markets. It's also recognized as an important strategy for firm growth and expansion. It is a challenging strategic activity, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. Relative to their larger multinational counterparts, difficulties for SMEs arise from inherent constraints on resources and capabilities which can affect the extent of their international involvement. As ownership is a known determinant of internationalization, understanding the processes behind family firm internationalization has become a very popular subject in both strategy and family business literatures. In particular, the unique features that might help or otherwise hinder family SMEs identify and commit resources to exploit international business opportunities is a growing area of research interest. A lot of work has already been done exploring about family ownership and internationalization in general, including how family control influences internationalization resources and capabilities, strategies and pathways, as well as how internationalization ultimately affects family firm continuity and performance. However, the fundamental processes which drive family firm internationalization strategy are less understood, as they have been primarily addressed at the firm level rather than the family level. With this gap in mind, our study reported in this presentation delves deeper into the underlying family dynamics that affect owner and managers' attitudes toward and the firm's resources and capabilities available for their internationalization. So in particular, we put forth that important relational dynamics are reflected in intergenerational succession patterns. However, despite succession being the most important challenge that most family firms face, coupled with the general understanding that succession affects internal resourcing and next generation commitment, very few studies to this date have focused on how intergenerational succession, as a unique feature of family firms, can influence the firm's internationalization. Those studies that have already done that suggest that the next generation leaders coming into business at the early stage can affect firm internationalization by influencing the firm's global orientation, motivation and commitment to internationalization, as well as the development of firm's resources and capabilities essential for successful international growth. Although it's useful, these studies do not actually adequately attend to the underlying relational mechanisms that determine why and how succession influences the internationalization of family SMEs. Therefore, we felt that it was necessary to develop some studies around this area to fill the gap in the current literature. So based on the behavioral theory of the firm and Penrose's theory of firm growth, the Uppsala model has grown into one of the most dominant theories in internationalization research. According to the revised Uppsala model, which was published in 2017, a firm's internationalization process consists of the state aspects and the change aspects. The state aspects refer to the firm's current level of resource commitment to to international activities and capabilities to exploit international opportunities. The change aspects relate to the firm's commitment processes, as well as commit processes like reconfiguring, coordinating, and committing resources to international activities, and the firm's knowledge development processes like learning, creating, and trust building processes. For example, the micro routines and activities undertaken in international markets foster learning and new knowledge, which assists the firms in developing capabilities for further expansion. In summary, a firm's state aspects and the change aspects influence each other. Specifically, the firm's current commitments and capabilities influence the changes available to the firm. In turn, commitment and the knowledge development processes influence the firm's capabilities and commitments made for the international activities. Empirical evidence continues to support the Uppsala model's recognition of the importance of experiential learning in increasing the firm's international commitment. The Uppsala model has also been used to explain the extent of the firm's international involvement. For the purpose of our study, we utilize 3 dimensions identified by previous authors to measure the extent of international involvement of the family firm. These are the foreign market entry methods employed, for example, from simple methods such as indirect exporting to the complex methods such as establishment of foreign subsidiaries. And the second aspect is market scope, like the number of countries or regions that the company has engaged with. And third, the product scope, from single standard to multiple customized serial products. Of particular relevance to our study is the emphasis that the Uppsala model places on a firm's pool of resources, the commitment of these resources towards an internationalization strategy, and how activities in international markets foster learning and the development of firm capabilities. Because the Uppsala model was introduced some 40 years ago, the RBV resource-based view theoretical perspective has made further contributions to our understanding of the role of firm resources and capabilities in the determination of the firm's international involvement. Consistent with the Uppsala model and RBV, we argue that the firm's commitment, decisions, resources, and the development of the development or refinement of the relevant capabilities from its knowledge development processes influence the extent of the firm's international involvement. However, we also acknowledge the development in international entrepreneurship research, which has brought to light the influence of individual actors such as entrepreneurs on firm-level commitment, decision, and resources. So in this study, we embrace course to incorporate the influence of individual decision makers on the firm's internationalization strategy, which is an issue that has largely been treated as a so-called black box in the Uppsala model. So in embracing the influence of individual decision makers, we argue that the extent of international involvement of a family firm is influenced by the interplay between firm level and the family level characteristics because of its effect on the commitment to and resources and capabilities for internationalization. Specifically, we suggest that firm level commitment to internationalization is significantly influenced by the attitudinal commitment of key family members. We also suggest that family members have a significant influence on the pool of firm resources available for internationalization, as well as the development or refinement of relevant capabilities. How family members influence firm-level commitment decisions, pool of resources and capabilities is explored in our study. As we said before, SMEs face constraints on their resources and the capabilities required for internationalization, especially for family SMEs. Although we know that family ownership is related to the firm's internationalization, the findings in the existing literature are very mixed. Some researchers argue that family ownership is positively related to internationalization because family ownership can help bring in family resources, and through the family's interaction with external stakeholders, they might create capabilities which are useful for internationalization, or they might find information that leads to internationalization of the firm. But other studies also argue that family ownership might restrict internationalization strategies in the family business because the family ownership locks the business activities within the family boundaries. Therefore, it might constrain the resources and capabilities related to internationalization. So, in this study, we are particularly interested in understanding how succession, intergenerational succession of family firms, which is a key feature or defining feature of the family firm, can influence the firm's internationalization. As I said before, this area is increasingly interesting to a lot of researchers, but still, to this date, it's still not adequately understood. Succession, as broadly defined as the transfer of leadership and control from one generation to the next, is by far the most researched topic in the family business field, because it represents one of the most significant challenges faced by family firms. Intergenerational succession is a complex process that involves the family, the business, and the ownership system, and often results in changes of business strategies, which can place strain on family relationship. Succession is also a determinant for entrepreneurship, and consequently it is reasonable to expect that succession may influence a family's attitudinal commitment towards internationalization. Researchers have already raised the possibility of a link between succession and internationalization, specifically that multi-generational family firms were found to be more likely to internationalize compared to the founder-led firms. So this finding has been supported by a lot of existing studies. However, there are also other studies that call into question the supposed positive link between succession and internationalization, suggesting that the interrelationship may just be more complex than previously suggested. So in this study, we argue that it is not succession per se, but the underlying intergenerational dynamics that influence the extent of the firm's international involvement. And this complexity is reflected in recent research, which suggests that differences in the internationalization of family firms may be due to relational and goal conflicts between generations of the family, as well as diminished concerns for transgenerational succession in later generations. Of relevance to this study is understanding how intergenerational dynamics underlying succession patterns influences family firm internationalization. So in prior literature, it's identified how different succession patterns may influence important aspects of the family firm, such as strategy and performance. For example, in Miller's work with his colleagues, Dan and Miller's work published in 2003, they argued that the rebellious succession pattern, where the successor's rejection of the incumbent's previous way of leading the business was identified. So this pattern was more likely to result in the adoption of a radical new strategic initiatives. Conversely, conservative succession patterns, when the successor's unhealthy attachment to the incumbent's previous way of leading the business was identified, and this pattern was more likely to result in the adoption of low-risk strategic initiatives and maintaining the status quo. And the third pattern that they identified was called wavering succession patterns, which means the successor's desire to make his or her mark on the firm, but is unsure how to. So there was a conflict between respecting incumbent and being independent. And this pattern often results in the abandonment of strategic initiatives because of the indecisive, inconsistent, and start-stop nature of strategic decision-making. Interestingly, the succession patterns identified by Miller and colleagues review the underlying nature of the incumbent-successor relationship, which in family firms is the intergenerational dynamics. And this revelation is significant because the intergenerational dynamics, not succession per se, as I said before, was found to significantly influence a family firm's strategy process. It is important to acknowledge that the three distinct types of succession pattern identified by Miller and colleagues may be of limited applicability to our study because they focused on succession patterns that lead to firm failure, and they were observed in a more Western context. Well, based on their findings, we can speculate that the intergenerational dynamics underlying the different succession patterns of family SMEs may influence their commitment to and the resources available for strategic initiatives such as internationalisation, as discussed in the following. So, with regard to commitment, the intergenerational dynamics underlying succession patterns may affect a family's attitudinal commitment to internationalisation. For example, in rebellious succession, a new CEO rejects the legacy of the prior generation, and there is wholesale eradication of the past and its practices. So they want to do things very differently from the so-called old man. Therefore, it is likely that rebellious successions will result in successors having an attitudinal commitment to internationalisation that is distinctly different from that of incumbents. In conservative successions, the successor is likely to exhibit the same level of attitudinal commitment to internationalisation, because that of the incumbent, of the successor's lack of individuation. With wavering successions, attitudinal commitment is likely to vary as a successor wrestles between attachment to and independence from the incumbent's view of internationalisation. And intergenerational dynamics may also have implications for the firm's resources and capabilities for internationalisation. In prior studies, it's found that intergenerational dynamics determine the effectiveness of successor selection and development. Before the actual transfer of ownership and management, the incumbent-successor relationship exerts the most decisive influence on the early stages of succession. With regard to successor development, international business activities provide an opportunity to develop the leadership skills of suitable family members. They also provide incumbents with the opportunity to create a lasting business legacy through the transference of their knowledge, skills, personal and business networks, and even an entrepreneurial spirit to the next generation. So the incumbent-successor relationship also influences the extent to which the tacit knowledge and the personal networks of the incumbent are transferred to the successor. And this degree of transference, in turn, will influence the firm's resources and the capabilities for strategic initiatives such as internationalization. The incumbent-successor relationship is particularly critical for the preservation of unique family-related competitive resources, which require a long time horizon to develop. So a healthy incumbent-successor relationship provides opportunities for both generations to work side by side. Besides the necessary business stability and continuity, incumbents can also provide successors with the freedom to identify, exploit, and learn from entrepreneurial opportunities such as international expansion. However, as highlighted in Miller Adol's work, not all succession patterns foster the type of incumbent-successor relationship required for the transference of knowledge and networks from one generation to the next. So, in summary, based on the past research on succession, intergenerational dynamics, and strategy process, we suggest in this study that the attitudinal commitment towards internationalization and the development and the transference to the next generation of the resources and the capabilities required for family firm internationalization may be influenced by succession patterns. So in the next, I'm going to outline qualitative research design to investigate the interrelationship between succession patterns and internationalization. So first of all, in this study, we acknowledge that very little research has been done on strategic management in the Chinese SMEs, particularly those that are owned by families. The dominance of the state-owned sector and an open market economy has created unique economic conditions in China, giving rise to both motivators and obstacles affecting how family firms perform across generations. The private sector, wherein Chinese family firms operate, was officially non-existent until significant economic reforms introducing market principles began in late 1970s. And this suggests that the majority of Chinese family firms have yet to experience a succession event, or otherwise have only transitioned from the founding generation to the second generation. On the other hand, the means by which Chinese family firms create wealth has also been affected by these market reforms, which have promoted rapid growth in international trade, which is the primary driver of China's remarkable economic performance over the past 3 decades. In fact, China is currently one of the most internationalized economies in the world. And the fast-growing private sector in China, which consists most of family firms, following an export-oriented model of development, has importantly contributed to these international business activities by exploring and exploiting supportive government policies that promote firm-level internationalization. And this includes government initiatives such like the New Silk Road project to stimulate Chinese exports. But export-focused SMEs in China face barriers that may limit their ability to realize such growth opportunities. For example, smaller and younger firms often need to acquire or develop different organizational resources and capabilities in order to successfully compete in international markets. On the other hand, despite a cultural tradition that emphasizes elders, the second generation owner managers have emerged as a major force in China's private economy. They are arguably more market-oriented and less reliant on the non-tradable resources and capabilities derived from family dynamics. Intergenerational disagreements and even conflicts are not uncommon today between the founder parents and the second generation owner managers. And some of these differences contribute to entrepreneurial venturing and business diversification, and others depress the entrepreneurial mindset and innovativeness of the business. As family dynamics and relations subtly change across generations, the emerging generation in Chinese family SMEs appeal to us as ideal cases for this study. So overall, in this study, we ask the question, how do different succession patterns influence the internationalization of Chinese family SMEs? So next, I'm going to introduce the methodology and main research methods that we adopted in conducting this qualitative project. As a matter of fact, the majority of research on family firm internationalization is based upon the positivist paradigm, as evidenced by the preference for hypothesis testing using quantitative research designs. However, in order to advance our understanding of family firm internationalization, such as the interrelationship between succession and internationalization, there is a call for the use of alternative research methods. So in our study, we embrace a post-positivist ontological position because of its emphasis on investigating and identifying relationships and non-relationships, respectively, between what we experience, what actually happens, and the underlying mechanisms that produce the events in the world. So we adopt a qualitative multiple case study methodology to explore the underlying structures, mechanisms, powers, and relations involved in the interplay of family business succession and internationalization. So first of all, as I said, this is a qualitative case. We adopted a qualitative case study approach. So the first decision to make is to select cases. Family SMEs were chosen by using a theoretical sampling approach. So cases were sourced from the eastern Chinese province of Jiangsu, which is one of the first industrialized regions in China and characterized by its rapid development of family firms, private entrepreneurship, and an export-oriented economy. So cases were selected based on three criteria. First, they had to be family SMEs. In the absence of the universally agreed definition, there is broad consensus that a firm owned and managed by a family is a family firm. As a result, in this study, we define a family firm as one that is majority owned by a family and has at least one family member on the management team. As SMEs in China is defined as one that has less than 2,000 employees and less than 400 million yuan in assets and less than 300 million yuan in annual sales, which was adopted to guide our sampling. Second, given the focus of our study, our sample firms had to have recently undergone intergenerational succession to the second generation and internationalized during or immediately after this process. Intergenerational succession to the second generation was defined as when the primary decision-making role, and ownership had been transferred from the founding generation to the next generation. Third, a case firm must have performed business activities in at least one market other than China. As the most common measure of internationalization in SME research is the ratio of foreign sales to total sales, the internationalization status of a firm was determined by whether or not it had any sales in foreign markets. So in this study, we eventually included 11 Chinese family SMEs, and the number of cases was guided by the principle of whether any new information was acquired from the inclusion of additional cases. As interviews and observations continued, information was increasingly repeated, signaling that subsequent emergence of new themes was unlikely. As we can see on this slide, in this table, all case firms were manufacturing firms founded between 1983 and 2002, and all of them employed between 60 and 250 employees. The owner-manager, the second generation owner-managers' ages at the time of generational transfer ranged from 27 to 38. All but 2 were male, and 3 were not the firstborn. Reasons for the intergenerational transfer, as we can see in the table, included the founder's health or retirement, or the founder leaving to establish or lead another business. So we mainly used the semi-structured interviews as a data collection method. So in order to achieve richness, robustness, and trustworthiness of the data, we adopted multiple connection methods, as I said before, mainly the semi-structured interviews. We also adopted personal observations and document inspections. Now, as we can see in this table on this slide, multiple interviews were conducted for each case firm, including the second generation owner-managers, employees from both management and non-management positions, family members or relatives who were directly or indirectly involved in the firms, and external stakeholders such as business partners and government officials. So in general, having 3 to 4 interviews per case reduced the dependence on any single interview and helped verify the authenticity of data that we connected. In this study, we commenced analysis when the fieldwork continued, so that emergent themes could be compared with earlier cases and applied to explore subsequent cases, which enables the identification of cross-case patterns and overarching themes. Interview recordings were transcribed and then coded for information related to the succession process, internationalization as well. So overarching themes were identified via keyword searching and repeated reading to capture meaning repetitions, which enables a clustering analysis that grouped together similar meanings in order to yield common themes. So the coded themes and relevant quotes were then provided to all authors for discussion. Questions and concerns were raised at these discussions, and areas for further analysis were identified. At times, our process require us going back to the raw data and extracting additional information. So repeating this process led to eventual consensus among all three authors on the emergent themes and the patterns. As interviews were originally conducted in Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, we checked the accuracy of our English transcripts through a back translation technique. Specifically, a PhD student who did not participate in the main study independently translated our English transcripts back into Chinese, and then we compared the original translated and the back translated texts, which suggested that the vast majority was consistent, and analysis was then conducted by all authors together with the back translator to investigate the sources of any inconsistencies. Then differences were identified as resulting from variances in wording and the sentence structure rather than misinterpretation. So now, as a result, we come down to this table, which provides representative features related to intergenerational succession patterns. So in this study, we identify three common patterns of intergenerational succession, namely evolutionary, which is a process planned, driven, and dominated by the incumbent; co-evolutionary, which is a process jointly designed and implemented by the incumbent and the successor; and the revolutionary process, which is a radical process that usually involves intergenerational disputes or conflicts, with the successor aggressively taking over business ownership from the incumbent. So our constructed typologies address the first part of our research question and enable a deeper investigation into the effects of succession on internationalization, which is going to be discussed through the next few slides. Okay. So, as I said before, three succession pattern types were identified, which enabled us to use them to explore the effects of intergenerational succession on internationalization of Chinese family SMEs. And our analysis focuses on the next generation's attitudinal commitment to internationalization and the firm's pool of resources and capabilities of internationalization and the resultant extent of the international involvement. In general, we indeed find that different succession patterns have different effects on the firm's internationalization process, which will link to a variation in the extent of international involvement. To support our findings, we provide representative quotes from interviews to illustrate the points that we made in our findings. So as we before we get into the the detailed findings, some very quick introduction of the key assumptions and definitions. So as I have used this term from time to time, the next generation's attitudinal commitment is defined as a favorable disposition towards internationalization and is an antecedent to behavioral commitment. So the argument is, before we take any actual action, we need to generate the attitude to take that action. So this attitude, which is described here as an attitudinal commitment, leads to the firm's actual action into international markets. And at the firm level, the firms use the internal pool of resources for international business activities, such as their networks, financial capital, experiences, and expertise, etc. Internationalization capabilities are developed by combining their commitment, the firm's commitment, and resources. For example, their networking capabilities, opportunity creating capabilities, learning capabilities, etc., etc. And the extent of international involvement, as we define here, has three dimensions. So first is the foreign market entry method, as I said before, from simple to complex. And second, the market scope, which means the number of countries or regions that the company sold to. And three, the product scope, from single standard product to multiple customized products. So as for the findings, first of all, we report the next generation's attitudinal commitment. As we can see that the three succession patterns lead to different levels of commitment of the next generation to internationalization. First of all, the evolutionary succession process provided a structured and a progressive approach to the transfer of firm leadership, in which the founder played a dominant role. The founder's very close control and presence in the entire process resulted in the successors receiving systematic training and developing a strategic vision aligned with the founders, which supported the continuity of existing business strategy and operations across generations. In all five firms under the evolutionary category, the decision to internationalize the firm was made by the founders in the early stages of succession, and this was acknowledged by all the five second generation owner managers, as we can see from some of these quotes. So not surprisingly, the founders played a crucial role in the discovery and evaluation of international market opportunities, and second generation owner managers mainly participated in the implementation of an existing internationalization initiative, mostly under the founder's supervision or guidance. Arguably, the primary purpose of internationalization for these firms, these evolutionary firms, was to supplement their existing operations in the domestic market by capturing an international market niche. For example, CEU 98 focused mainly on the domestic market, while international engagement was simply described as icing on the cake. Therefore, the firm was more committed to its business in the domestic market than internationalization. And a similar case was found in FEU 91 as well. More importantly, the internationalization process formed part of the successors' development in these five companies, which again was dominated by the founder. Here, internationalization was a project that was used to equip the second generation owner managers with leadership and management experience and skills. So the ultimate purpose of internationalization in these firms, in these evolutionary firms, was successor development, to which the firm was more committed than internationalization per se. As implementers, the second generation owner managers in the evolutionary succession pattern did not have to actively engage in any international opportunity exploration. By the time succession completed, international engagements were already established and exports regularized. Consequently, the founders retired after the transfer. When elaborating on this succession, the founder believed that they actually did not encourage the next generation to be highly committed to internationalization, but they want them to work hard to maintain what has already been done in the businesses. And the second pattern, the co-evolutionary succession processes, were loosely structured and jointly driven by the founders and the second generation owner-managers, which encouraged the second generation to explore new business opportunities internationally, which is different from the evolutionary pattern. And in the co-evolutionary pattern, the founders introduced the owner-managers into the second generation owner-managers into the business, and then gave them considerable autonomy. So the second generation initiatives were accepted and endorsed by the founders, who in turn provided support for them to explore new opportunities in international markets. And the founders' support, in turn, enhanced the second generation owner-manager determination to pursue firm growth and business diversification in the international markets. Throughout succession, the second generation owner-managers were widely and deeply involved in the firm's decision-making and management. So the second generation owner-managers were more actively engaged in international opportunity creation and exploitation. In fact, all three firms captured their initial international market information from sources connected to the owner-managers, to the second generation owner-managers, rather than the founders. And because of the second generation owner-managers' involvement and their initiative in the firm's internationalization, coupled with the founders' support and assistance, these firms were able to develop a long-term vision and a strategy pertaining to their international engagement. It's notable that the next generation attitudinal commitment to internationalization was not only strong, but also sustained through the firm's strategic moves with respect to R&D, and particularly the potential collaboration with foreign partners. Finally, in the revolutionary pattern, the second generation owner-managers took a more radical approach to succession. Rather than being granted leadership by the founders, they actually pushed the founders and seized leadership rapidly. A consequence on the family side was that the founder-successor relationship appeared to be very unengaged, mutually distrustful, or even, in some cases, hostile. On the business side, most existing operations started by the founders were terminated or significantly changed because they were not consistent with the second generation owner-managers' internationalization agenda. In these cases, the second generation owner-manager intended to internationalize things long before the transfer of ownership. All three second generation owner-managers in the revolutionary category initiated internationalization as they launched a revolution against their respective founder parent. So arguably the internationalization of these firms were an integral part of their strategic departure from the founder's legacy. And the second generation owner-managers criticized the founders for being conservative, reluctant to grow and change, and they believed that the best strategy for the firm was to grow, not just domestically, but internationally. So the founder's legacy was soon replaced by the second generation desire to internationalize to international markets. So to summarize, we see that succession process having an impact on the next generation's attitudinal commitment to internationalization. With the founders' dominance in the evolutionary successions, the second generation owner managers were mostly implementers of their father's decision to internationalize. While in the co-evolutionary and revolutionary successions, the second generation owner managers were much more engaged in designing the firm's future, including internationalization. Therefore, we propose our first proposition. Succession patterns affect attitudinal commitment of the next generation towards internationalization. Specifically, compared to the evolutionary succession pattern, co-evolutionary and revolutionary succession patterns are more likely to be associated with higher levels of attitudinal commitment to internationalization by the next generation. So this is our P1. I would move on to the resources available for internationalization. So succession patterns do not only influence the next generation attitudes or attitudinal commitment to internationalization, but also the firm's resources available for internationalization. First of all, in the evolutionary pattern, the second generation was well equipped with knowledge and skills related to the firm's existing business as a result of the founders' purposefully designed successor development. So the internationalization of these firms was in essence the founders' initiative, which aimed at strengthening the existing business and improving firm performance without radical changes to the firm's existing strategy and structure. So international operations were relatively simple and did not significantly increase the firm's operation costs. And this implies that the firms did not expand their resource pool for internationalization significantly, which would usually result in increased cost associated with resource access, acquisition, and allocation. They only used the existing resources, which enables the firms to control their cost and potential risks. And also, opportunities were perceived and created mostly from the founders' established networks and exploited by deploying existing resources without having to risk sourcing new resources from unfamiliar environments or investing in new capability development. As mentioned earlier, in the evolutionary pattern, the next generation's role was to assure smooth implementation of the firm's internationalization. So as implementers, the second generation owner managers mainly used existing resources. In effect, these firms tended to frame their international engagement within the range of resources in their possession. So their intention to grow or diversify the international engagement remains very low, because ambitious growth and diversification in remote markets would consume their limited existing resources. So in line with this mindset, all 5 firms in this pattern tended to concentrate on a limited number of international markets that they could easily control and monitor. Well, in comparison, the co-evolutionary successions are characterized with the successors' initiative, the founders' guidance and the facilitation, and intergenerational engagement and collaboration. The founder and the successors in this pattern widely collaborated throughout the succession process and on internationalization process as well. Firms in this pattern were able to utilize a wide range of resources. On the one hand, the second generation owner managers had access to the firm's existing resources or new resources through the founders' networks. On the other hand, the second generation owner managers could also develop new network resources which were utilized in their international opportunity exploration and exploitation. So a wide range of resources were also made available for the next generation internationalization, as we can see from all these cases under this pattern. The third pattern, the revolutionary successions, were dominantly driven by successors in order to radically restructure or replace the existing business and strategy with new initiatives. So the second generation owner managers in this pattern, they are revolutionaries. In other words, they are rebellious. They have this mindset and behaviors which contributed to an unengaged intergenerational relationship. Either consciously or subconsciously, the second generation owner managers chose to overlook or reject the founder's advice or offer of help, and as a result had a narrow range of resources for their internationalization. And the founder's perspective was provided. The founders, most of the founders were willing to help their sons or daughters, but was rejected because the second generation owner managers were worried about the founders' intervention. Instead of inheriting existing resources, the revolutionary owner managers relied on their own networks and managed to acquire new resources in order to explore new opportunities internationally, which differentiated them from their founder parents and was recognized by the market. So as a result, these second generation owner managers developed new business relationships, mostly from their own family, social and business networks instead of the founders. However, due to a rejection of the founders' support, these firms had relatively constrained resources to explore international opportunities, as well as limited knowledge about the confidence and limited knowledge about the international markets. In which case, some of them tended to be not sufficiently confident. In accordance with our earlier findings, these second generation owner managers were highly committed to expanding internationally. But this ambition was considerably restricted by their narrow range of resources. Therefore, we argue that co-evolutionary successions where intergenerational collaborations were prevalent presented systematic advantages in their resources for internationalization. And through intergenerational collaboration, particularly the co-initiative in internationalization, these firms were able to access and utilize a wide range of resources, and their evolutionary and revolutionary counterparts both had a narrow range of resources for internationalization. However, it's worth noting that these two patterns exhibited a narrow range of resources for different reasons. So in the evolutionary pattern, the founders played a strong role in succession and internationalization, which restricted the second generation's attitudinal commitment to internationalization and the initiative to acquire resources, while firms in the revolutionary pattern experienced a second generation driven succession process, which intentionally excluded the founder's legacy from the firm. As a result, these owner-managers, second-generation owner-managers, discarded existing resources while internationalization, or in the internationalization. So all these observations and findings lead to our second proposition. Succession patterns affect the pool of resources available for internationalization, specifically compared to evolutionary and revolutionary succession patterns. The co-evolutionary succession pattern is more likely to be associated with a greater or a wider pool of resources available for internationalization. And the third part of findings is about the capability learning and extent of international involvement. Drawing on the Uppsala model, we observed differences in the extent of firms' international involvement as measured by foreign market entry modes, market scope, and product scope. Based on our previous two propositions, we believe that these differences are indirectly related to succession patterns through the next generation's attitudinal commitment and resources, which combined informed the firm's capability learning and that development for internationalization. First of all, the evolutionary succession pattern led to a low level of attitudinal commitment, as we said before. So for these second-generation owner-managers, internationalization was simply one of the founders' legacies that they were to maintain. And in line with this, a narrow pool of resources was made available for internationalization. And in these cases, a combination of low attitudinal commitment and a narrow pool of resources resulted in the firms engaging in minimal learning activities to build new capabilities for internationalization. So this is shared by all the case companies under this category. So all these 5 firms chose to export by following a simple and a straightforward process, which was in line with their low attitudinal commitment and the narrow pool of resources related to internationalization. As a result, they developed the capability to maintain a low extent of international involvement and engaged in indirect exporting of single standardized products to just 1 or 2 foreign markets, or through a trade agent. Secondly, the co-evolutionary successions engaged both funders and second generation in all succession events, which facilitated the co-initiative in internationalization and a high level of next generation attitudinal commitment to internationalization. So with the second generation's autonomy and the founders' support, the firms were able to use numerous resources, which in turn allowed the next generation to learn and implement new ideas and experiences. So with a strong attitudinal commitment to and a broad pool of resources for internationalization, these firms engaged in a variety of learning initiatives and activities. As a result, a wide range of knowledge and skills were acquired and capabilities developed that enabled the firms to achieve a greater extent of international involvement. Specifically, they exported multiple customized products to numerous foreign markets, contrasting their evolutionary and revolutionary counterparts. Most of them were also involved in direct exporting, which is a more complex market entry mode than indirect export. Thirdly, the revolutionary successions. This pattern exhibited overwhelmingly powerful second-generation owner-managers in the succession processes, who initiated and dominated the entire internationalization process as well. To depart from their founders' existing business that was solely home market oriented, these second generation owner managers had a very strong attitudinal commitment to internationalization. However, because of the underlying problematic intergenerational family dynamics, which led to the second generation's rebellious behaviors, mindset and behaviors towards the founders, resources offered by the founders were rejected, as we said before. Instead, the second generation owner managers excluded the founders from their own decision making and implementation. So in practice, despite the second generation's strong attitudinal commitment to internationalization, their rejection of the founders' resources left the firms with a very narrow pool of resources for internationalization, which in turn restricted them from further capability learning and development that would facilitate the firm's international opportunity exploration. So given the lack of a rich pool of resources, these firms were unable to engage in wide and deep learning activities. Therefore, they developed limited capabilities for their internationalization. Consequently, these highly committed firms could only achieve a low level of international involvement and exported a single standardized product to one foreign market, mostly through a trade agent. So these observations, on this slide, it summarizes the international drivers and outcomes, which I described before. So 3 different patterns leads to different types of motivation for internationalization and different levels or with breadth of the resources, then different patterns of international involvement. So these observations and insights lead to our third proposition. Through the effect of the attitudinal commitments to and the pool of resources for internationalization, succession patterns have an effect on the firm's capability learning and development, and the resultant extent of international involvement. Specifically compared to evolutionary and revolutionary succession patterns, the co-evolutionary succession pattern is likely to be associated with a greater extent of international involvement. So now, to conclude our presentation, showing on the slides at the moment is the framework, the overarching framework summarizing the main findings and insights, as well as the 3 propositions. Now, contributions and implications. So, our study demonstrates that the 3 succession patterns and the firm's extent of international involvement are explicitly linked. So, in fact, we show that the connection between succession and internationalization is deeper and much more complex than previous studies have implied. Although prior research suggests the successor's vision, characteristics, and competencies determine the level of commitment to internationalization, we find that succession pattern type also influences the next generation's attitudinal commitment, and consequently that of the firm to internationalization. Specifically, if we can recall the findings, the co-evolutionary and revolutionary succession patterns resulted in successors with a high degree of attitudinal commitment to internationalization, largely because they had the opportunity to identify and initiate or co-initiate the internationalization strategy, and possesses the autonomy to acquire or direct firm resources to advance the strategy. In contrast, in the evolutionary succession pattern, the successor was more likely to maintain what the founder had initiated, and therefore unlikely to promote the firm's internationalization strategy any further. With that said, commitment alone is insufficient. So we also shed light on the family dynamics inherent in succession patterns that affects the resources available for internationalization, and consequently the firm's capability learning and extent of international involvement. For example, evolutionary and revolutionary succession patterns both limited international networks because entrepreneurial actors, namely the incumbent and the successor respectively, did not use the full scope of networks potentially available to the firm. In the evolutionary pattern, international networks cultivated by the founder were utilized, but not extended by the successor because of a lack of autonomy, skill, and attitudinal commitment to internationalization. Whereas in the revolutionary pattern, international networks cultivated by the founder were discarded altogether and replaced with newer and possibly less developed networks. So these networks in particular were established by the successors on their own, without the assistance of other important family members. As a result, the successor did not have access to the critical extended networks developed by the incumbent when executing the firm's internationalization strategy. Critically, our study reveals that although the next generation family firm leaders may share some similar positive attitudes towards internationalization, family firms embracing a co-evolutionary succession pattern will be more successful in their international expansion because of the effect of the incumbent-successor relationship on capability learning and the pool of resources available for internationalization. Our study also highlights that internationalization may be used by family firms as a means to develop and prepare the next generation as future leaders. However, as our results suggest, not all succession patterns are the same when it comes to utilizing internationalization to develop future business leaders. Compared to the evolutionary and revolutionary succession patterns, the co-evolutionary succession pattern provided the most favorable environment for the incumbent and successor to work together on internationalization-related initiatives that facilitated the capability learning and the transfer of knowledge and skills to the next generation. So, considering the unique social and economic circumstances affecting interpersonal relationships inside and outside the firm, as well as the incentives and opportunities for family SMEs to internationalize, China offers an ideal setting to explore the interconnections between succession and internationalization. With that said, recent news reports have highlighted a looming succession crisis in China. And these point out that there is often significant disagreement over the future strategic directions of Chinese family firms due to a distinct cultural and educational divide between the founding generation and their offspring. Although an international alignment of visions for future growth may be even more challenging in China, similar to most normative models of succession based on the Western world, we find that a co-evolutionary approach to succession can help bridge the gap. With that said, our study also highlights the negative implications of both evolutionary and revolutionary succession patterns, which conform to and deviate from traditional cultural virtues, respectively. As one of the world's oldest cultures, most social values in China are derived from collectivist ideologies. Virtues related to these ideologies, such as respecting one's parents, elders, and ancestors, the primacy of social harmony and hierarchical relations, honoring family as the basic unit of society, rather than the individual, and the traditional cultural norm of primogeniture and the males as leaders of the family, have been proposed to influence succession in Chinese family firms. Although it has been argued that the effect of traditional cultural virtues on Chinese family firms is generally positive, its influence is also known to have negative consequences. So we shed light on some of these consequences in our study. On that note, although preserved by many modern family firms, we also show that the succession patterns of Chinese family SMEs do not always reflect traditional Chinese culture. By design, our study focused on Chinese family SMEs that experienced the two significant events for the first time: the intergenerational succession to the second generation, and venturing beyond their domestic market, namely newly internationalized. So this focus enabled us to gain a more fine-grained understanding of the interrelationship between succession and internationalization. However, it also limits the generalizability of our findings. We envision future research that explores whether the three distinct succession patterns identified here in our study, along with their effects on internationalization, are similar in other social and institutional contexts. Since we focused on newly internationalized Chinese family SMEs, we cannot ascertain whether alternative succession patterns are exhibited by family firms that have yet to internationalize or already have an established international business, and what effect those unobserved patterns might have on current or subsequent internationalization. We hope to inspire future research that explores the effects of succession patterns that result in more advanced stages of internationalization or even de-internationalization. Since we focused solely on intergenerational transfer to the second generation, future research can also help us understand how intergenerational succession from the second generation and beyond, as well as intergenerational transfers, can influence commitment and outcomes pertaining to internationalization. In general, the interplay between intergenerational succession and internationalization and the implications for the family firm strategy process represent an important and promising area of future research for scholars, business families, and those that advise them. For example, we show that family firms can overcome some of the inherent challenges of SME internationalization by focusing on the underlying intergenerational dynamics that affect the exploration and exploitation of international business opportunities on both an individual and family level. While working with the next generation is understood to facilitate internationalization in general, it is not merely about a transference of resources per se. Our study reviews that unless the next generation displays the appropriate attitudinal commitment to internationalization, such resources can be underutilized or even undermined, hence fostering intergenerational relationship, and a healthy succession process are key factors in developing the capabilities, skills, and knowledge integral to internationalization strategy of family SMEs. Last but not least, although we shed light on the intergenerational mechanisms underlying the capability development of internationalizing family firms, namely attitudinal commitment and resource availability, which in concert leads to greater capability learning opportunities for internationalization. There is much more work that can be done, considering that a foundational aspect of succession is in fact learning. We encourage future research which more deeply investigates how various succession patterns might directly affect capability learning and development. For example, as successors and incumbents work alongside each other, co-evolutionary succession offers ideal conditions for the intergenerational transfer of tacit knowledge as well as an opportunity to engage in more meaningful trial and error learning. So, thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I hope you find this project inspiring and useful to some extent. Well, if you have any questions or comments, please feel welcome to send them to me, and you can find my contact details at the bottom of this slide. Once again, thank you very much.